Welcome to or welcome back to Wrong Sports, getting back into my What If series. My first part, I talked all about the biggest what if decisions, what if scandals that could have happened in the NCAA or in college football over the 2 decades of the 1970s and 1980s. And I'm going to stay in those decades, except this time I'm going to be talking about the biggest what if coaching decisions and potential coaching hires that could have happened and really shook up college football during the 1970s and 1980s. But before I get into that, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below. Ring that bell so you get updates on brand new videos that I will be dropping. I will be having more What If series coming out throughout the rest of the summer. Plus, I'm also going to be having some more shorts where I talk all about the pre-Heisman winners. I've been doing that ever since May, and I'm going to continue that throughout the summer, breaking down all of the pre-Heisman winners from 1886 all the way until 1935. So make sure, as always, you check that out in the archives right now. And please check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. Link also in the description below. But I'm going to start off this episode with a what-if coaching decision/hire that could have caused a huge domino effect. And it has to do with what if Joe Paterno left Penn State to take the New England Patriots job in 1973. If you don't know about this, it was a pretty big deal throughout all of Pennsylvania, obviously, and New England through the spring of 1973. Joe Paterno was ending the 1972 season with a top 10 record and a 10-win season, but towards the end of the season, rumors circulated that Billy Sullivan, the owner of the New England Patriots, was interested in Paterno to take over the Pats. According to reports, before the Sugar Bowl on New Year's Eve 1972, Paterno had accepted the offer as the New England head coach and general manager before having second thoughts. The second thoughts were that Billy Sullivan had made remarks about Paterno taking the offer, which Paterno never liked, especially before a game, as Paterno felt like it was a distraction, and it was, because Penn State lost 14-0. It was the first time Penn State was shut out in a couple of years, but the remarks and the Sugar Bowl result really soured Joe Paterno, even though the contract that was offered to him, and this was according to a Patriots News article from 1973, Paterno apparently turned down a $1.3 million contract, or more than $200,000 a year, to stay at Penn State. But he wasn't the only college coach that New England went after. As like I mentioned, this is a domino effect, because Billy Sullivan didn't get Joe Paterno, he went to another college coach in Oklahoma's head coach, Chuck Fairbanks. According to Barry Switzer, who was on Fairbanks' staff, Chuck Fairbanks had been secretly making the 185-mile drive to meet Sullivan in Dallas for several weeks and would then take the job after about 3 or 4 meetings. Because of this, Oklahoma would have to hire a new head coach and would offer the job to Barry Switzer, who took the offer immediately instead of going to New England with Fairbanks. So again, that is another big what if. Also, going back to Paterno, had he taken the New England job, who would have taken the Penn State job? Well, my guess would have been George Welsh, who was the future Navy and Virginia head coach. If you remember, Welsh would leave the Penn State staff after the 1972 Sugar Bowl to take the job at Navy and was one of Paterno's top assistants. And if he would have got hired, obviously that would have changed a lot of the future of Penn State. And one of the coaches in that last what if has to do with something that would happen in this next what if scenario, and it has to do with Tom Osborne. And if Dr. Tom left Nebraska in 1978. I have always heard of this story, but it was only recently that I looked more into it just to see how close it was to happening. Coach Tom Osborne was finishing his 6th year at Nebraska with a 55-15-2 record, but he had only beaten Oklahoma 1 time, and Nebraska fans and boosters were not happy with Osborne, even though he had won at least 9 games a season, and they were yearly ranked in or near the top 10. There is a story of after the 1976 Blue Bonnet Bowl, and I would just hope that they would bring that name back just 1 year instead of having sponsors, because that's such a cool bowl name. Anyway, after that bowl game, Osborne was told by a booster that if he had lost that game, boosters were going to go to the administrative executive staff and make a strong case to get rid of him. But in 1978, he was at least offered a way out in case he was fired from Nebraska, and it came from inside his own conference in Colorado. The Buffaloes were looking to upgrade their program and went after Osborne since he had a great offensive mind and could recruit the area. Colorado had brought Tom Osborne to Boulder, and he saw the contract, which was giving him a 6-figure raise, more money for his assistants, and it would have a fan base that would give him some time to win. Along with this, Coach Osborne saw the great scenery and outdoor activities that Boulder could offer. And Tom was an avid fisherman, and I couldn't confirm it, but you have to wonder if the school or a booster offered the coach his own fishing boat if he came to Boulder, just to add a little bit more to the offer. In the end, Coach Osborne was a man who made decisions not based on money. Couldn't see himself coaching against players he just recruited to Nebraska. And also, he felt it was hypocritical to do that, since athletes were not really transferring from school to school as much as they do now. Also, he did mention the reason for fishing why he didn't take the job either, because he felt that he would fish too much if he was in Boulder, and that would also hinder his performance. But not taking the job and staying in Lincoln, Nebraska would create one of the best coaching runs in college football, also great dynasty that would happen in college football with Nebraska in the 1990s, as they would win 3 national titles, and Tom Osborne would finally get his national title that he was so close to getting in the 1970s and in 1980s. And also, I want to mention another guy who I mentioned in my previous What If, because he would end up taking the Colorado job. That would be Chuck Fairbanks, who left the New England Patriots in a very controversial fashion to take the Colorado job. And he would end up being one of the worst head coaching hires in the 1970s and probably 1980s too. And I go over this coaching hire and his coaching run in Colorado in a previous video I did all about the worst coaching hires in the 1970s. You can see it in the upper right-hand corner, also in the description below. But talking about a coach that I did do a previous video about, this has to do with Frank Kush, and what if he wasn't fired from Arizona State in 1979? Frank Kush came to Arizona State when they were in the Boulder Conference and far away from a big-time bowl game or even a national championship. Kush was even told by the previous coach, Dan Devine, that he would be better off coming with him to Missouri than to stay at Arizona State. Well, Kush would do the opposite of what his mentor said and stayed with the Sun Devils, and Kush would pick right back off from where Devine left the program, and he would end up winning tons of games, bringing Arizona State into the Pac-10, and they were just a few votes away from being a national championship as well. But Kush wasn't without controversy, as he had tough practices in the desert heat and be physical with players. That would be his downfall, and I went over all of this, like I mentioned, in my Frank Kush video, and you can check it out in the link above, also in the description below. But I'll summarize the controversy here. A punter on the team said that Kush hit him, and after a short investigation, Kush was gone, and he would end up going into the CFL, and then the NFL, and then the USFL over the next couple of years, eventually leaving coaching after 1985. So that's why you gotta wonder, what if he wasn't fired from Arizona State? He would have been there until 1985 or so, and Arizona State was still pretty good in the years after Kush left, and that was even with some penalties they got in the 1980 season. The next coach after Kush was Darryl Rogers, who had good teams from 1980 to 1982, mostly with those players recruited by Kush and the former staff. Rogers would then hit a decline in 1983, 1984, so had Kush still been there, the winning would have continued, and maybe Arizona State would have won the Pac-10 more times with Kush, and maybe even won a national championship. Finally, another web that shoots off this is that Kush would go to the Baltimore Colts in 1982 and lead them to a winless season in 1982, giving them the first pick in 1983. That was the famous draft with John Elway, who, after consulting with his father, another coach, in Jack Elway, who made it well known that they would not play for the Colts under Kush. And it wasn't just because of the state of the team, but the fact that Jack Elway actually hated Frank Kush. So maybe had Kush not gotten fired from Arizona State, stayed with Arizona State, the Colts would have hired someone else and they could have potentially gotten Elway and it could have changed their future. This is just slight because the Colts were in a pretty bad way in 1983. But anyway, Kush getting fired from Arizona State is a huge what if because it did set the program back. They did go up and down over the next couple of years. Like I mentioned, they did have some really good teams, but they were kind of up and down. And I feel like if Kush would have stayed there until 1985, it would have given the program some stability. And here is another controversial coach for another what if. What if Woody Hayes doesn't strike a Clemson player in 1978 and get fired? One of the more famous downfalls is Woody Hayes, who after almost 3 decades at Ohio State, he would be canned after he put his hands and struck a Clemson player towards the end of the 1978 Gator Bowl. But that wasn't the first time Woody's anger was taken out on others or other things, as during the 1977 season, he hurled equipment in fury on the sidelines and assaulted an Oklahoma student manager after losing to the Sooners. Then later in the season, he punched an ABC cameraman in the chest after losing to Michigan. So when Woody's choking of another player was brought to light, that was the last straw for Woody Hayes. But what if he had contained his anger and didn't get canned and had stayed at Ohio State? How long would he have stayed and what would have happened? Well, that last part is hard to answer, as after the choking incident, the Ohio State athletic director, Hugh Hindman, was furious and confronted Woody in the locker room, and the two almost came to blows. A.D. Hindman would eventually fire Hayes the next morning, but it seemed like Woody Hayes was walking a tightrope for the last few years due to those violent outbursts I mentioned, so this just made it easy for Hindman to let him go. Also, Hayes was not a man to apologize or to also find fault in himself, so when all of those previous incidents happened, it just made him and his personality look even worse to anyone outside the college football bubble. I'm sure it would have just been a matter of time, though, before the Ohio State president got tired of Woody, because the Ohio State athletic director, Hindman, was also tired of these outbursts, hence the profanity-laced conversation Hugh and Woody had after the Gator Bowl, and also the athletic director had brought up other times that Woody had done crazy things, whether it be in practice or off camera. And if you remember, in the early 1960s, Ohio State was still trying to balance academics and their athletic program, and they even declined a bid to the Rose Bowl in the early 1960s due to them wanting to show that they were more of an academic institution than an athletic institution. But in the end, Woody Hayes was gone, and this was even after Woody Hayes had won 8 of the last 10 Big Ten titles, and winning those plus winning Rose Bowls hid much of Woody's antics. And now in part 2 of the video, we are now in the 1980s, and I'm going to start it off with one of the biggest turnarounds in the 1980s, that be the Miami Hurricanes and their football program. And what if Howard Schnellenberger didn't take that USFL offer in 1983? Okay, I'm not going to go into Schnellenberger's entire coaching career because that could take a couple of minutes, but just after Miami's upset of the Cornhuskers and their undefeated team in the Orange Bowl in 1983, Howard Schnellenberger would leave. The reason for that was because Howard was going to become the part owner, president, general manager, and head coach of the Spirit of Miami of the United States Football League, which was actually a relocated Washington Federals franchise. He was even introduced into the USFL that spring and was even on some USFL shows promoting his new job in the league. But in August of 1984, the USFL would announce that it would shift to a fall schedule. The owner-to-be for the Federals would back out of the deal, knowing that he could not hope to compete head-to-head with the Miami Dolphins. After that owner left, a new backer would come in, but he was mentioning that he was going to move the team to Orlando to become the Renegades. And after hearing that, Schnellenberger opted not to follow the team to Orlando and instead sit out of football until he latched onto the Louisville football program in 1986. But this decision would open up a huge huge web of what ifs. The first and probably the biggest is how many more national titles Miami would have won had Howard Schnellenberger stayed. Howard left this team on top since the next two coaches won national titles, and Howard was an amazing recruiter, so Miami could have won even more national titles had he stayed around with more of the local and great talent that was down there. But that would also bring up another what if, which would have to do with the coach that succeeded him in Jimmy Johnson. Johnson was a well-known coach at Oklahoma State, but he wasn't an upper echelon coach, and fans of Miami even chanted Jimmy Who when he came to South Florida to take over for Schnellenberger. This job obviously made Jimmy Johnson because he would win a national title and jump to the NFL to win Super Bowls with the Dallas Cowboys. So Howard Schnellenberger leaving Miami actually helped out Jimmy Johnson a hell of a lot more than it helped out Howard Schnellenberger, because it put Jimmy Johnson on a completely different trajectory. So yeah, when you talk about Jimmy Johnson and the Dallas Cowboys dynasty, you really got to talk about Howard Schnellenberger, because if it wasn't for Howard leaving Miami, who knows what would have happened to the Dallas Cowboys, and hell, maybe even Howard Schnellenberger would have taken over for the Dallas Cowboys in 1989. Up next are two schools that could have potentially hired the old ball coach. That would be what if Mississippi State or LSU took a chance on hiring Steve Spurrier in 1986. The old ball coach has said that he was never good in interviews, and that was probably a big reason for him not getting either one of these jobs. Mississippi State ended up hiring Rocky Felker, who got them to one winning season over the next 5 years, and LSU would end up hiring Mike Archer, who did have 2 good seasons to start before he was dumped towards the end. But what would have happened if Spurrier got that Mississippi State coaching job? Mississippi State had not won the SEC since before World War II, so maybe Spurrier could have brought his high-powered offense to Starkville and won. I mean, Spurrier was a winner at Duke, for God's sakes, and not many people can say that. Plus, Mississippi State did not have nearly the academics Duke did, so Spurrier could have gotten the talent he needed to win, and a lot faster, too. Same goes for LSU, but he only had one interview with LSU, so he never really got as far as he did in the process. And if you want another funny coincidence in this whole scenario, how about this? At LSU, Mike Archer would take over for Bill Arnsparger, who left to become the athletic director at Florida, who then in 1990 would hire Steve Spurrier. But still, it is really strange that even though he had the 3 really good seasons in Tampa Bay with a professional football team, that Mississippi State wouldn't hire him here. Up next is another coach from the other big Florida university. That would be Florida State. And get this, what if Bobby Bowden had taken the Alabama job in 1987? Yes, this was a thing that slightly had a chance to happen. So in case you didn't know this, Bobby Bowden from Birmingham, Alabama, raised in Alabama, wanted to go to Alabama, eventually did, but only as a freshman. He didn't play much, so he would eventually transfer to Samford. And little did everyone know that this guy would eventually become one of the best coaches in all of college football history. And by 1986, pretty much everyone had known this because Bowden had built a great program at Florida State. And after Ray Perkins left Alabama, it was easy for many alumni and fans to think that Bowden would want this job. That was because, well, Bowden had said so. He had actually publicly said that he wouldn't be interested in this job. And I prefaced this by saying that he slightly took this Alabama job because, well, he did meet with the boosters of Alabama. According to Bobby Bowden, he didn't need to interview because he thought that it was a formality that he would be offered the job and eventually take it. But when Bowden went to meet those Alabama boosters, some of the boosters in the room, there were about 20 of them, were not there to offer him the job immediately. They wanted to meet him and talk with him. And as soon as Bowden saw that, he turned down the job and he didn't want to interview. And I don't know if Alabama tried to hire him again and if Bobby Bowden just said no, or if they just kind of nixed going after him after that first deal. Whatever the reason was, well, apparently Alabama had already been interviewing someone else at the same time they were talking with Bobby Bowden. That would be Bill Curry. who only got the interview and would eventually get the Alabama job because Ray Perkins gave a recommendation for him. And even Curry was shocked when he got the job, as he didn't think he had any chance and thought Bowden would take the job if he was offered it. Well, little did Curry know, Bowden was never offered the job, and Curry was a coach at Georgia Tech and content with staying there. It was his alma mater. And once he was offered the job, Curry would take it while Bowden would stay at Florida State and, starting the next year in 1987, lead Florida State to 10 wins or more and a bowl game win over the next 13 seasons. Bowden did have other offers while he was at Florida State, but the fact that it got to the point of him entertaining the idea is why this is a big what if, and especially because it's Alabama, obviously. Had Bowden come to Alabama, it really would have changed a ton of things, like potentially most of Florida State's history, and maybe them not even getting into the ACC, because if you remember, in 1987, they were still an independent and would be until about the mid-90s. Also, if Bowden took this Alabama job, it would have been interesting to see who would have gotten the Florida State job. And had Bowden come to Bama, it would have changed so many things with Bama. That being, they might have won more than one national title. Between Bear Bryant and Nick Saban, they might have won 3 or 4. Who knows? It's just so crazy to think the amount of other what-ifs that go along with what if Bobby Bowden had taken the job with Alabama. And finally, here is a potential what-if coaching hire that may not have happened, and luckily it did, because it insanely changed a college football program for the better. What if Kansas State didn't hire Bill Snyder in 1989? Not sure how much worse Kansas State could have gotten if Snyder didn't come to this team, as Kansas State were 299 and 510 in their first 93 years of playing football before Snyder came there. And after the 2 stints that Snyder had at Kansas State, he went 215 and 117, meaning that he won just about 70% as many games during his 27 years at Kansas State than the school did in the 93 years previous to him. But Snyder knew how to turn around terrible teams, as he was on the staff for Hayden Fry when they turned around Iowa. But when he got to Manhattan, Kansas, he saw the situation was much worse than what he had inherited at Iowa. Kansas State had not won a game in over 2 years, but by year 3, Snyder and Kansas State had a winning record. And from 1993 to 2000, Kansas State won 9 games or more a season. And they also won a Big 12 title in 2003. This was Kansas State's first conference title, by the way, since 1934, which is insane. So yeah, this is still considered one of the greatest turnarounds in college football history, but what if Kansas State didn't hire Snyder? Well, I don't think Kansas State would have been kicked out of the Big 12, even though they were so bad, but I do think that conversation would have eventually been brought up. Other names that were also considered for the job besides Snyder were Charlie Bailey was coaching at Memphis State and would also be part of the booster paying scandal only a year or so later. Finally, John Fox, yes, the future NFL coach, was also talked about potentially taking this job, and he was even the defensive coordinator at this point at Pitt, and was looking for a way out, and thought that Kansas State was that way out, even though it probably wouldn't have lasted long for him either. Instead, though, Kansas State turned Fox down due to experience, but again, there is another huge what if John Fox would have taken this job. I mean, would he have gotten any of those other jobs after it? Because it would have been pretty hard for him to turn around this program. And that is why what Chris Kleinman is doing right now at Kansas State is pretty remarkable, because it's pretty hard for anyone besides Bill Snyder to have won at this school. So the fact that Kleinman is doing so well, that is really cool. And tell me what other what-if coaching hires or not hires that could have happened in college football during the 1970s and 1980s. Tell me about it right now in the comments below. Make sure, as always, you're subscribed to the channel, like and share this video with other college sports fans, and check out my Patreon right now, patreon.com/wrongsports.